Ephraim didn't believe in omens, but when his axe lodged sideways into the frozen birch and refused to budge, he paused for the first time in hours and heard something he hadn't expected. Not a cry, not a bird call, but silence that felt full. He turned towards the deeper wood, heart suddenly tight, and that's when he saw her. A girl in a torn wedding dress, sitting barefoot on a patch of snow-dusted moss, her arms wrapped around her knees, and in her trembling hands, the limp body of a dead sparrow. Her veil was askew, snagged in a low pine branch, and her face, young, pale, and blank as stone, didn't even flinch when he stepped forward. Ephraim froze, not because of fear, but because of how wrong it all looked. She didn't belong out here, not alone, not dressed like that, not holding death like it was the only thing left to her. He crouched slowly, careful not to spook her, but she didn't move, didn't speak. Only her eyes shifted slightly, noticing him the way a deer might acknowledge a distant storm, something to survive or not. "You hurt?" he asked, voice low, rough from days of not speaking, but she blinked once and shook her head. Still she said nothing. Her shoes were gone, toes red with cold, her dress muddy at the hem, and the little bird in her lap looked like it had died recently. Still warm maybe, feathers still clean. Ephraim noticed then that she was cradling it like a child. No tracks around her, no horse, no wagon nearby. She'd come here alone or been left. Either way, she hadn't moved in some time. "Name?" he tried again. She swallowed but gave no answer. That was fine. He understood silence better than words. Slowly, he pulled off his wool coat, approached like a man approaching an injured animal, and held it out. She didn't reach for it, but when he draped it over her shoulders, she didn't resist. The way she clutched the sparrow tighter, though, he saw the meaning. It was more than a bird. It was what had died. Something sacred, something final. "All right then," he muttered, not expecting a reply. "I'm Ephraim. Cabin's not far." She didn't look at him, not fully, but when he took a step backward and waited, she stood. Weak, shivering, but upright. The sparrow stayed in her hand. She followed him like a ghost through the trees, not once asking where or why. The snow started falling again, soft and sparse, and as they walked side by side in silence, Ephraim knew one thing for certain. This girl hadn't just been left behind. She'd been broken somewhere people were supposed to love her, and the forest had become the only place that didn't lie. The cabin wasn't much, just rough-hewn logs and a crooked chimney clinging to the edge of a frozen creek, but Ephraim had kept it dry and warm, and that counted for something when the wind scraped through the trees like a knife. He pushed open the door with his shoulder, nodded for her to enter first, and watched as the girl hesitated for a single heartbeat, just long enough to make him wonder if she'd bolt. But then she stepped inside, Sparrow still cradled in one hand, like it had whispered its last breath into her palm. He set down his axe, closed the door against the rising cold, and stoked the fire until it glowed hot and wide, licking the edges of the stone hearth like it was hungry too. She didn't sit, didn't move far from the door, just stood there in his coat, dress stained, veil clinging to her shoulder, looking at nothing and everything all at once. Ephraim had seen bears with gentler eyes, because at least a bear would growl. This girl, this bride, was pure stillness, like grief turned human. He moved slowly, grabbing a clean blanket from the cot, setting it on the bench by the fire, then ladled hot water into a tin mug and placed it on the table between them. Still, she didn't speak, didn't cry. He didn't ask why she was out there. Not yet. People didn't come to the woods with a dead sparrow and no shoes, unless the story behind it hurt more than the cold. So he let her be, only watching as she finally stepped toward the heat and sat stiff-backed on the bench, staring into the flames. The bird stayed in her lap. "You can stay here tonight," Ephraim said quietly, not trying to fill the silence, just make room inside it. "Tomorrow, if you want, I'll take you into town. Or not. Ain't no one up here but me." She glanced at him then, quick, like touching hot metal, and nodded once. He took it as agreement, though he couldn't be sure. Her lips parted like she might speak, but all that came was a breath, shaky and small, and then she closed her eyes like even that cost too much. Ephraim didn't press her. He just sat down on the opposite bench, poured himself a mug of water, and let the fire do what it could. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she whispered, "Odessa." He turned slightly, not wanting to scare it off. "Your name?" She nodded, eyes still fixed on the fire. "They left me. Said I wasn't good for children. Said the wedding was off." Her fingers curled around the Sparrow like it might fall apart if she let go. "They didn't even take me home." Ephraim felt a burn in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. He'd seen cruelty before, but this was something else. "Well," he said, voice like gravel, "you're not theirs now." Odessa said nothing more, but she pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders and didn't flinch when the fire popped loud in the hearth. The bird stayed in her lap, still and sacred, and Ephraim knew this wasn't just a woman abandoned. It was a soul returned to the forest, waiting to see if kindness could still survive out here. By morning, the snow had softened the world into silence again, blanketing Ephraim's roof and yard with a clean white hush that made even the birds think twice before singing. But inside the cabin, Odessa sat exactly where he'd left her, on the bench, back straight, hair falling over her shoulder in soft, tangled ribbons, the dead Sparrow still cupped in her hands like a secret too fragile to bury. Ephraim had let her sleep, or at least rest. He'd stretched himself across the floor near the hearth, one eye always half open, just in case she decided to disappear into the dark. But she hadn't moved, not even when the fire had gone down to embers. Now, as he quietly relit it and stirred oats into a tin pot, he glanced her way and saw something new, her lips moving, slow, soundless, like she was telling the bird something only it could hear. He didn't interrupt. Whatever memory she was sorting through, whatever ghost she was talking to, he figured it had more right to listen than he did. But eventually, the quiet stretched too long, and so he set a bowl beside her and asked gently, "Want to tell me about him?" Odessa blinked, like surfacing from underwater, and looked at the bowl first, then at him. "It was a girl," she said hoarsely. "The Sparrow. I used to feed her near the chapel window. She'd come when the bells rang." Ephraim waited. She looked down again. "This morning before the ceremony, I found her dead outside my dressing tent. No one else cared. I picked her up, and they told me to throw her away, said it was a bad sign, and when I hesitated, they left." Her voice caught on the last word, but she pushed through it. "Left me in the woods like a stain they didn't want to follow them home." Ephraim tightened his jaw. The thought of someone discarding a girl like her, gentle enough to mourn a bird, made his chest heavy with something like fury. "What kind of folks do that?" he muttered. Odessa's eyes flicked toward him, surprised maybe by the edge in his voice, but she said nothing. He leaned back on his heels. "You keep holding her like that. You'll have to bury her soon. Ground's soft enough behind the maple." Odessa hesitated, then nodded. They walked out together, Ephraim breaking the snow ahead with his boots while she followed, clutching the bird as if it still breathed. When they reached the maple tree, she knelt, and Ephraim handed her a small spade. She dug slowly, carefully, and placed the sparrow in the hollow she made like she was laying a child to rest. No tears came, only stillness. Ephraim waited until she stood again, and then, on impulse, reached down and brushed snow from a flat stone, placing it gently over the grave. "She died flying toward the wrong people," Odessa whispered. "I know what that feels like." Ephraim looked at her then, not the dress or the mess of her veil or the shame stitched into every crease, but at her eyes, hollowed out from silence and survival. "Maybe now," he said softly. "You fly the other way." She didn't answer, but when they turned back toward the cabin, he noticed she walked a little closer to his side. The next morning, without words or ceremony, Ephraim set out 2 cups on the table instead of 1, and though Odessa didn't comment, her gaze lingered on the second for a moment longer than necessary, before she took the seat across from him. She looked cleaner today, not because she'd bathed, there was no tub in the cabin, but because the layers of dirt and sorrow had shifted slightly in the firelight, like she was starting to reappear beneath the ashes. Her veil was gone now, folded neatly in a corner, and her hair, though still tangled, had been pushed behind her ears. Ephraim had never much been a talker, and that morning he didn't try to become one, but he cooked the eggs with a bit more salt, and gave her the softer side of the cornbread. And when she ate it slowly, silently, he figured that was as close to thank you as he needed. The air between them wasn't warm yet, but it wasn't frozen either. It was like 2 people walking through fog, not sure if they're heading to the same place, but grateful not to be alone in it. After breakfast, Odessa stood and walked to the window, her fingers trailing across the wooden frame. "It's quiet here," she said softly, almost to herself. "Even the wind sounds like it's remembering something." Ephraim glanced up. "That's why I stayed." She turned toward him, arms crossed loosely, uncertain. "Were you ever married?" The question hung there, delicate and dangerous, but Ephraim didn't flinch. "A long time ago," he said. "She liked lilies. Died birthing a son who didn't breathe long enough to be named." Odessa nodded slowly, absorbing it without pity. "I thought I'd have 6, she said. "Named after trees. My ma thought I was foolish." Ephraim smiled faintly. "Foolishness is better than forgetting." The words weren't meant to land hard, but they did, and he saw it in the way Odessa's eyes flickered. Not in pain, but in awareness, like something old had stirred inside her. She stepped away from the window and sat again, closer this time, not directly beside him, but not across the room either. "What do I do now?" she asked quietly. It was the first real question she'd given him, the first time she admitted she didn't already have the answer. Ephraim didn't rush. He leaned back in his chair, watching the way the firelight danced across her dress, and said, "You stay until you don't need to anymore. No one comes out here. No one will bother you." Odessa's hands rested in her lap, empty now, the sparrow buried, the veil folded, and the silence between them beginning to feel less like absence and more like peace. She looked up at him, not with hope, not yet, but with something closer to permission. "All right," she whispered, "but I want to help." Ephraim nodded. "Then start by resting. The rest can come later." And so they passed the day without ceremony, him chopping wood, her sweeping dust that didn't matter, both pretending they weren't watching each other heal. 600 words. 1 paragraph. Ephraim found the veil the next morning, fluttering gently on the fence post just beyond the front porch, pinned by a twig like someone had meant for it to be seen but not touched. He didn't ask Odessa about it. though he saw her watching it from the cabin window, arms folded tight across her chest like she was holding in more than warmth. The thing looked strange out there. Bridal lace catching the sunrise in strands of gold, swaying like a flag of surrender or maybe defiance. Ephraim figured it was both. She'd been quieter than usual that morning, and that was saying something. No words over breakfast, no idle glances, not even the soft way she'd started nodding when he passed. Just stillness. He chopped wood for longer than needed, letting the rhythm fill the spaces where conversation might have gone. When he came back in, Odessa was sweeping again, more fiercely this time, like she was scrubbing the memory of something she couldn't name. "You hung it out there?" he asked finally, jerking his head toward the veil. She paused, bristles of the broom mid-step. "It didn't belong inside," she said. "Too many lies stitched into it." Ephraim didn't argue. He understood the weight of fabric that told the wrong story. "Want me to take it down?" Odessa hesitated. "No," she whispered. "Let it rot. Let the rain eat it thread by thread." She returned to sweeping, and Ephraim moved to the stove, stirring beans, the silence between them louder than ever. Finally she spoke again, low and raw. "They didn't even look back, Ephraim. Not one of them. Not my father. Not the man I was supposed to marry. Not even the priest. They just turned and rode off like I was ash from a fire they didn't want in their lungs." Her voice cracked, and he turned toward her, but she didn't want comfort. Not yet. "I didn't cry then, not even when the birds flew away." She stopped sweeping. "But I almost did when you gave me your coat." Ephraim swallowed hard. There were no right words for that. Only the truth. "That coat wasn't doing me any good just hanging there," he said. Seemed like it wanted to be useful again. Odessa laughed, small, surprised, and quickly silenced by the emotion it carried. She wiped her cheek and sat down, letting the broom lean against the wall. "I keep dreaming the sparrow flies again," she murmured. "But she's white. Pure white, and she flies over the chapel roof, higher than they ever thought she could." Ephraim crouched near the fire, poking at the logs, keeping his eyes low. "Maybe that's not just a dream." Odessa looked at him for a long while, the light from the window drawing soft gold lines across her face. Then she stood and stepped outside, barefoot in the snow, and stood before the fence post. She didn't touch the veil, just looked at it. And when the wind came, she didn't shield her face. She let it blow straight through her like she was daring the world to do it again. Ephraim watched from the doorway, and in that moment, she didn't look broken anymore. She looked like something that had decided to stand. The snow fell heavy that night, thick flakes drifting down like feathers from a sky that had finally stopped pretending to be kind. And though Ephraim had offered Odessa the cot, she'd chosen the floor near the hearth again, her back against the wall, eyes open long after the fire had burned low. He sat across from her in his old rocking chair, whittling aimlessly at a scrap of pine wood, not shaping anything in particular, just moving his hands, letting the rhythm speak where words couldn't. The room was quiet, except for the occasional snap of settling timber and the distant howl of wind that couldn't quite get in. Then, somewhere between midnight and whatever came after, Odessa said softly, "Why didn't you ask me to leave?" Ephraim looked up, surprised not by the question but by the way her voice carried now, less like a ghost, more like a woman who remembered she had weight. "Didn't seem like you had somewhere better to go," he replied. She studied him, face flickering orange in the firelight, and then she nodded once, like his answer was enough. "I used to pray for someone to see me," she whispered. "Not save me. Just see me. As I was. Not what they hoped I'd be." Ephraim's hand stilled over the pine scrap. What did they hope? That I'd bleed perfect, birth perfect, walk perfect, speak quiet, obey loud. Her voice curled around the words like old smoke. I couldn't. Wouldn't. Ephraim leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, eyes steady. I don't need perfect, he said. Don't even trust it when I see it. Odessa stared at him, long and hard, and then, slowly, like a stone loosening from a frozen riverbank, she said, I've been waiting. He didn't ask for what. The way she said it made it clear the answer wasn't simple. So he just nodded, and she went on. Not for someone to fix me, just for the silence to end with something other than more silence. Ephraim stood then, walked to the shelf, and took down a tin box. From it, he pulled out a carved sparrow, old, sanded smooth, unfinished. Was making this for my wife, never finished it. He crossed the room and placed it gently beside Odessa on the floor. Figured it didn't know how to fly without her. Odessa picked it up with careful fingers, tracing the shape. Maybe it was waiting too, she whispered. Ephraim didn't reply. He just sat back down, and for the first time since she arrived, they both let the fire burn low without trying to make it bigger. And when Odessa finally curled beneath the blanket, the carved sparrow clutched close to her chest. Ephraim watched her until her breathing slowed, wondering, not for the first time, if maybe the forest hadn't given him a ghost, but something braver, a woman who had walked through fire and still wanted to speak. 600 words, one paragraph. Odessa found it while looking for coffee, her fingers brushing past jars of dried beans and winter salt until one shifted strangely beneath her hand. A squat glass jar at the back of the shelf, sealed with wax and dust. She pulled it down, wiped the lid with the hem of her sleeve, and squinted through the smudged glass. Inside, sitting atop a folded scrap of linen, was a gold ring. Simple, dulled by time, but unmistakable. She didn't open it, just held it for a moment before turning, half expecting Ephraim to be behind her. But the room was empty, save for the soft scratch of wind pushing against the shutters. When he returned from checking the traps, snow trailing from his boots, she set the jar on the table and stepped aside. He saw it instantly, and something in his shoulders went tight. Didn't mean to snoop, she said gently. Ephraim shook his head, brushing the snow from his sleeves. You didn't. It's just been a while since anyone touched that. He didn't reach for it, just stood there, watching the light catch the edge of the gold through the glass. It hers, Odessa asked. Your wife's? He nodded. She never liked wearing it, said rings made her feel caught, but she gave it to me before she passed, told me to put it somewhere I'd forget. Odessa sat down slowly, curling her fingers around the edge of the table. You didn't forget. No, he said quietly. I just stopped needing to look at it. For a while, neither of them moved. Then Odessa whispered, They made me wear mine before I even met him. Slipped it on during rehearsal, like sealing a deal on a house. She traced a line on the table's grain with her fingernail. I never took it off, until they left me. I dropped it in the snow on purpose. Ephraim finally sat, his eyes not on the ring, but on her. Good riddance. Odessa gave a small smile, tired but real. I used to think the ring meant I'd finally be seen, that I'd be someone's... someone. She looked up. But no one ever asked me what I wanted to be seen as. Ephraim nodded, slow and deliberate. What do you want now? She stared at him for a long time, eyes unreadable. I don't know yet, she said. But I know I don't want to disappear again. He reached for the jar, opened it, and gently took the ring out, holding it between two fingers. Then, instead of slipping it away, he set it on the windowsill, where the firelight touched it. "Then we won't hide it," he said. "Not because it means anything between us, but because it meant something once, and maybe now it means something different." Odessa looked at the ring, then at Ephraim, and the silence between them was softer than it had ever been, like a lullaby hummed without words. Outside, the snow had paused, the sky opening up in pale streaks of gold. And inside, though nothing was spoken, something had shifted. A truth exposed, not as a wound, but as a thread pulled free from a knot neither of them had meant to tie. Odessa had never liked mirrors, but there was no glass in Ephraim's cabin to remind her of the woman she used to be, only a tin basin and a chipped ceramic pitcher that caught just enough light to show shape without detail. And that morning, after a restless night full of sparrow wings and whispered vows, she poured warm water into the basin and finally looked down. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the cloth from around her fingers. They were rough now, blistered slightly from sweeping and chopping kindling, no longer the smooth, pale hands that once folded in prayer or fastened buttons behind her neck. She dipped them into the water slowly, feeling the heat settle into her skin like permission. Behind her, Ephraim moved quietly, slicing apples at the table, pretending not to notice. But she knew he was listening, just as he always did. Not for gossip or confessions, but for the quiet sound a person made when they were deciding to stay. Odessa scrubbed gently, not just the dirt, but the weight of other people's expectations, washing each knuckle like it had been bruised by silence. She found a nail brush tucked beneath the basin and used it carefully, catching glimpses of her reflection in the warped metal. Eyes tired but clear, cheeks fuller now with food and rest. When she finished, she stood with water dripping from her fingers and didn't dry them right away. Instead, she walked to the table, stood opposite Ephraim, and placed her wet palms flat on the wood between them. "Would you help me braid my hair?" she asked quietly. He looked up, knife pausing over an apple slice, and in his expression she saw surprise, but not the kind that feared. "I'm not good at that," he said. "I don't need it to be perfect," she replied. I haven't touched it in days. It feels too heavy." Ephraim wiped his hands on a cloth, stood, and walked around the table. She turned, lifted her hair, and waited. His fingers were rough, not delicate, but he was gentle, moving slowly as if the strands might unravel more than tangles. She closed her eyes. No one had touched her hair since her mother, long before the engagement, long before the ring, back when touch had meant care instead of control. Ephraim didn't speak, didn't rush. He parted her hair into 3 pieces and began to weave, not tightly, not precisely, but honestly. When he finished, he tied the end with a bit of twine and let his hand rest on her shoulder for just a moment longer than necessary. Odessa didn't move. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, though she couldn't see it, and stepped back. She turned then, braid resting down her back like a line drawn through her past, and smiled. "I think I'll keep this one." He smiled too, faint and crooked. "Looks like it belongs to you." And for the first time, it did. The water in the basin had gone still again, and outside the snow began to melt, little by little, as if even the forest had decided to let something go. The letter came tucked under a rock beside the gate, sealed with wax, so rushed it looked more like a smear than a stamp. And when Ephraim found it that morning while fetching firewood, he stared at it for a long moment before bringing it inside. Odessa was stirring stew by the hearth, braid still looped neatly down her back. And when she saw the envelope in his hand, her face went pale, as if the past had found her too quickly. It's from them, she said, not asking. Ephraim nodded and set it gently on the table between them like something that might burn. For a long while, neither of them moved. Then, quietly, Odessa reached for it, broke the seal with her thumb, and unfolded the paper. She didn't read it aloud, but her lips moved as her eyes scanned the lines, and when she finished, she held the page with shaking hands. "They want me back," she said flatly. "Say the wedding was a mistake, on their part. Say the doctor was wrong. That I'm not barren after all. They've scheduled a new date, a new dress, a new man." Her voice cracked around the last word, and she set the letter down like it had grown teeth. "He's the mayor's nephew, just returned from New York, polite, educated, desperate to marry someone with land." Ephraim didn't speak. His hands rested on the back of a chair, white-knuckled but steady. Odessa looked at him, something wild flickering behind her calm. "They left me in the woods, Ephraim. They left me with a dead bird and a lie that nearly killed me." Her voice grew louder, angrier. "Now they want to dress me up again and parade me through town like I'm worth something because a man says I am." She stood, paced once, then stopped. "Do you think I should go?" Ephraim didn't answer right away. He walked to the window, stared out at the tree where the sparrow was buried, and said softly, "Depends on what you're still waiting for." Odessa's breath caught. She looked down at her hands, clean now, strong. "I don't think I'm waiting anymore," she whispered. "I think I'm deciding." Ephraim turned to face her, something unspoken in his eyes. "Then decide for you, not them, not me. You." She nodded slowly, fingers curling into fists, then loosening. "They think I'll crawl back because I've been gone long enough to be scared." Her jaw clenched. "But I'm not scared, Ephraim. Not anymore." She walked to the hearth, took the letter, and fed it into the flames. They watched it curl, blacken, and vanish, the wax seal hissing as it melted into nothing. Outside, the sky broke open, and the first real sun they'd seen in weeks spilled across the clearing like something sacred. Odessa turned to Ephraim, her eyes fierce. "I'm not a bride they forgot. I'm a woman they never really saw." He stepped closer, not touching her yet, but near enough for her to feel it. "I see you," he said. And this time, she didn't cry, but she did reach for his hand, and he let her take it like he'd been waiting his whole life. Spring bloomed like breath on the ridge, not in bursts of color or grand rebirth, but in quiet things. Wild iris pushing up through the broken floorboards of the old porch, the creek singing a little louder each morning, the air softer against the skin. Odessa rose early now, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The cabin no longer felt like a place borrowed from grief. It felt like hers, not in name or deed, but in rhythm. Ephraim still didn't speak much, and she didn't need him to. He brought her tea in the mornings, carved small shapes from scrap wood in the evenings, and in between, they shared a silence that had turned into something gentler than words. Today he was carving her braid, not a symbol, not a trophy, just the shape of it, strand by strand, into a piece of ash wood polished smooth by his thumb. He sat on the porch step while she shelled beans beside him, the late sun warming the earth. And when she asked why he chose that part of her, he looked at her with something too steady to be longing, and said, "Because you never untie it." She smiled then, brushing hair from her face with flour-dusted fingers. "Because it took me too long to weave it for real." He handed her the carved piece, still warm from his palm, and she turned it over in her hands. A perfect loop, the ends tucked under like a promise kept. "They'll wonder where I went," she said. "Let them," he replied. "They'll think I'm dead or ruined. Then they'll finally be half right." Odessa laughed quietly, setting the carving down beside the bowl of beans. She looked at Ephraim then, not as a stranger who'd once found her with nothing, but as the man who never asked her to become anything more than what she already was. "Will you cut my hair one day?" she asked softly. "If I ask you to?" He nodded. "Only if you ask." She looked down at her braid, trailing over her shoulder like a rope she no longer needed to escape. "Not yet," she said. "Not for a long time." He leaned back on his elbows, watching the sky turn from gold to fire, and she reached over, brushing sawdust from his sleeve. They didn't speak of love, not because it wasn't there, but because it had arrived too honestly to be labeled. It was in the way he warmed her socks near the fire before she woke, in the way she laid an extra bowl even when he was outside, in the rhythm they'd created, quiet and clean. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Ephraim stood and offered his hand. She took it. They stepped inside, her braid swinging gently behind her like the last page of a story she'd rewritten herself. And on the windowsill, the old wedding ring still caught the firelight. But no one had touched it in weeks. Odessa hadn't stepped past the tree line in weeks, not since the day Ephraim first found her cradling the Sparrow like a lost breath. But that morning, without a word, she wrapped her shawl tight, tied her boots with calm fingers, and stood at the cabin door with her braid resting proud against her back. Ephraim looked up from where he sat, sharpening his blade, and didn't ask where she was going. He only reached for the second canteen, filled it, and placed it in her hand. "I'll be back by dusk," she said, not as a question, not as apology. He nodded once. "If not, I'll come find you." She smiled faintly, then stepped out into the thinning snow. The walk to town wasn't far, but every step felt like a page being turned on a book they'd tried to burn. When she reached the church, the doors were shut, but she didn't knock. She walked to the side fence, to the old hitching post where someone, perhaps even she, weeks ago, had tied a ribbon for luck. And there, caught on a nail, hung the edge of her original veil, half torn, stained with pine pitch and frost. She plucked it loose. No one saw her yet, not until she turned toward the market square, the veil trailing from her hand like a surrender she no longer owed. The seamstress gasped first, nearly dropping her bolt of cloth. Then came a muttered whisper. "Is that her? The barren one?" But Odessa didn't look down. She walked straight back past the man who once told her not to smile too wide, past the chapel where a priest had said nothing while her name was erased, and finally past the mayor's nephew, standing outside the dry goods store in a pressed coat that still couldn't hide the coward under it. "Odessa," he said, as if tasting a name he thought had spoiled. She stopped. Not close, just far enough for truth to carry. "The doctor was wrong," he said, gesturing feebly. "We could still—" "The doctor was right," she interrupted. "About you." He flinched, and she moved past him, toward the chapel. Inside, it smelled like wax and dust and borrowed promises. She didn't linger. She walked to the shelf near the altar, where her mother's old songbook had been kept since childhood. It was still there, its leather worn but whole. She took it, placed the veil inside like a pressed flower, and left without bowing her head. The walk back felt lighter, though the hill was steeper. By the time the cabin came into view, Ephraim was on the porch, carving again. She stepped up beside him, not out of breath, not broken. "Did they try to stop you?" he asked. She shook her head. "They didn't know how." He nodded, eyes scanning her face, the book in her hands, the veil now tucked into her satchel. "You got what you needed?" Odessa looked out at the trees, their branches bare and reaching, and said, "Not yet. But I know where it is now." She sat beside him, hands raw from wind but steady. And Ephraim, without comment, placed a new carving in her lap, a sparrow in flight. This one had wings. Odessa smiled, leaned back against the porch rail, and let her braid rest against her shoulder like a flag not surrendered, but reclaimed. The braid had become part of her, a quiet thread running through every day she'd rebuilt. And though Odessa never touched it during those early mornings on the porch or the long, fire-lit evenings in the cabin, Ephraim noticed the way her fingers would sometimes trail the edge of it, like testing a rope before cutting it loose. Spring had come for real now, soft green blades pushing through the soil, birds singing like they'd forgotten the silence of snow, and Ephraim had started planting again, neat rows that curved toward the tree line where the sparrow's grave still lay undisturbed. That morning, Odessa didn't rise with the sun like usual. She stayed curled under the quilt, eyes open but still, as if waiting for the light to reach her fully. Ephraim didn't press. He lit the fire, fed the chickens, and came back to find her sitting at the table with the old tin basin full of warm water, a small mirror beside it, and a pair of shears lying quietly on the cloth. "Going somewhere?" he asked, half smiling. She shook her head. "Number, I think I'm staying, but I need to let some things go." Ephraim nodded. "You want help?" Odessa looked at him, then down at the braid. "Not this time." She picked up the shears and paused, eyes soft but steady. Then, slowly, she reached back and unlooped the braid from her shoulder, letting it hang down her back one last time. One twist, then another, the strands loosening like threads unspooling from an old memory. She worked carefully, reverently, until the braid came undone and her hair spilled loose and wild, curling at the ends like it had waited years to be free. She didn't cut it. Not yet. She only looked at it in the mirror, touched it like a question answered. "I thought the braid meant I survived," she said. "But maybe it just meant I hadn't moved on." Ephraim sat across from her, saying nothing, but watching her the way a man watches sunrise after too many cold nights. Odessa picked up the shears, held them a moment, then set them down. "Not today," she said. "Maybe never. I just wanted to know I could." She tied her hair back loosely, not a braid this time, just a ribbon. Then she stood, walked to the porch, and looked out over the ridge. "There's a girl in town," she said. "Orphan. They keep her in the storeroom behind the mill. I thought I might teach her to read, if she wants." Ephraim joined her, crossing his arms against the morning breeze. "You think they'll let her come?" "They didn't stop me," Odessa said. "They won't stop her." He nodded. "She'll be lucky to have you." Odessa leaned her shoulder against his. "I'm lucky to have had you first." The sky brightened, and a bird, a real one this time, feathered and alive, landed on the porch rail, tilting its head toward them with casual curiosity. Odessa smiled. "Looks like she made it after all." Ephraim didn't ask who she meant. He didn't need to. And when they stepped back inside, Odessa set the basin aside, folded the cloth, and reached for the carved sparrow on the shelf. She placed it beside the old wedding ring, and for the first time, neither object felt like a memory. They felt like choices. And as the day rose around them, warm and bright and free, Odessa walked forward, not as a bride forgotten, but as a woman remembered, by herself most of all. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had seen her take down that braid, would you have called it weakness or the beginning of something sacred? Tell us in the comments.